Kizamde! Hop on the beat!
The JoJo series has garnered quite the reputation online over the years for the often homoerotic nature of its art. If you were to ask someone to describe JoJo in just a handful of words, I'm sure that the descriptor of gay or feminine wouldn't be that far down the list. This idea has actually turned out to be somewhat controversial, with certain people becoming defensive over the label or attempting to deny the presence of anything LGBT in the series, often from a bigoted point of view. To dispel this right out the gate, JoJo contains multiple confirmed LGBT characters scattered all across its nearly 40-year run. Beyond explicit representation, the series also clearly contains themes of homoeroticism that had already been present in the manga before that point. However, I feel like people often label the series that way without actually taking the time to analyze the nature of the series' representation or themes. So in this video, I want to do just that. Take a look at the LGBT-centric themes and characters of the series, the ways that has evolved over time, and how it has influenced Araki's work. I think the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to people saying JoJo is gay would have to be the pure surface level observation of Araki's art gradually becoming more feminine over time. Of course, we have the more muscular characters of parts 1 to 3 moving to the more lean builds we see depicted in later parts. This is probably why a lot of people will negatively label the series as gay starting around part 5, a story featuring mostly men whose appearance and fashion take on a seemingly more feminine appearance. However, I don't think this is an accurate assessment of the series at all, which isn't surprising considering the homophobic nature of a lot of those comments. In reality, the JoJo series has dealt with homoeroticism ever since its inception, and that can be clearly seen in both its art and the story itself. One of the best places to start would be with Araki's direct influences. Indeed, a lot of popular manga have dealt with themes of homosexuality, explicit or not, long before JoJo did. Like with all things manga, you can trace a lot of it back to the stories of Osamu Tezuka, whose massive body of work has touched on LGBT themes multiple times. In perhaps the earliest example, Tezuka's 1953 manga series Princess Knight depicted its main character Sapphire as androgynously switching between female and male roles. In his 1976 drama series Mu, Tezuka depicted an explicit homosexual relationship between two of its main characters. And in one of his most famous series, the 1973 medical drama Blackjack, we have the appearance of Kei Kisaragi, perhaps one of the earliest transgender characters in manga who switches to living as a man after undergoing surgery. It goes without saying that Tezuka has influenced Araki, as is true for all other manga artists to come after him. But Araki has actually spoken about Tezuka's influence more directly. After all, Araki's debut one-shot, Poker Under Arms, was selected as a runner-up for the Tezuka Awards, and Araki met Tezuka himself as a result of this. In March of 2025, Araki spoke at the Tezuka Manga Museum to celebrate its 30th anniversary, and cited much of Tezuka's manga as an influence. When discussing Blackjack, Araki highlights the first 6 chapters of the reissued first volume as particularly great, one of which is the 1974 chapter featuring the first appearance of the transgender character. I think it goes without saying that Tezuka broke ground not just through his storytelling, but also with the representation of LGBT themes and characters, which no doubt influenced the work of Araki and many others. I do think that when it comes to popular manga, Japan is often more open to these themes than a lot of Western works are, since even to this day there seems to be an apprehension to certain themes in mainstream movies or TV. However, Araki is also known for being heavily influenced by Western comics, art, and fashion, and when it comes to LGBT themes, those are absolutely worth mentioning. As an artist, Araki wears his influences on his sleeve and is constantly paying homage to all kinds of work across different mediums. Obviously, we have the famous music references and the many homages to his favorite films we see in the story. However, Araki also references poses seen in other pieces of art and photography, which we can see appear directly in his work. One of his earliest and most common influences is the work of the Puerto Rican fashion illustrator Antonio Lopez. This is mainly seen across parts 1, 2, and 3, with many iconic poses and outfit designs paying homage to Lopez's work. In particular, I noticed the striking feminine lips of Araki's male characters being a direct parallel to many of Lopez's pieces, which were in turn drawn from both male and female models alike, creating a generally androgynous quality to both. What's also notable for this discussion is that Antonio Lopez was an openly gay man who explored themes of his sexuality through his work. Another prevalent influence in Araki's early work is the artist Tony Viramontes, who we see referenced almost as much as Lopez in the early JoJo parts. And once again, we see male and female figures alike being referenced to create JoJo's iconic style. It's also from Viramontes in particular that we see one of the most iconic poses in the JoJo series through Dio in Part 3, also taken from an illustration of a female model. Like Lopez, Viramontes was also a gay man, and his work portrayed the beauty of men and women in a very unique way. It's starting in Part 4 that we begin to see Araki take on a new influence, with many of his illustrations from this point on being direct references to fashion magazine photo shoots. Just like before, we see Araki referencing the poses and clothing of models regardless of gender, which I feel leads to the blend of masculinity and femininity that is most iconic to his work. The sheer amount of poses referenced is too many to even show in one video, but I think with what I have shown you can start to recognize the inherent sensuality of his art. Araki has mentioned the influence Italy has had on him, which is not at all surprising with him drawing on that country for his story's settings multiple times. He specifically points out the prevalence of Italian fashion and the aesthetics of gay culture leaving an impression on him, which greatly influenced his work. Moving past the artwork, Araki has also depicted many explicitly LGBT characters in the story itself. Now, the degree to which this is depicted in the story certainly varies. Many characters have the inherently androgynous quality of Araki's art while being within the story heterosexual. I would say Araki's first and most obvious LGBT character is the series' most iconic overarching villain, Dio Brando. This also brings me to one of the most important sources I'll be drawing from in this video, Araki's 2007 interview in Eureka magazine, where he speaks at length with the sociologist and yaoi manga expert Junko Kaneda. Kaneda has written extensively on the history of BL or boys love manga through the lens of gender theory and sociology. Kaneda is what one might describe as an eccentric character, which has led some people to attempt to dismiss this interview as a rabid fan projecting her headcanon onto Araki with him just playing along. However, I disagree with this reading, and I think it's clear that the interview is good-natured, and Araki seems genuinely interested in her unique reading of the manga. The part I do want to focus on here doesn't actually come directly from Kaneda, but from Araki himself. Here Araki says fairly explicitly that Dio is bisexual and could go for either a man or a woman. And it isn't just in the Kaneda interview either, since in a talk at Tohoku University that year, Araki again says that Dio is interested in both women and men. I can also say confidently that this is not some post hoc insertion of representation onto a character that it wasn't written for. Dio is a character deeply rooted in sexuality, and this had already been directly portrayed in the manga itself decades beforehand. I've already mentioned the deep influence of gay artists on the early arcs of JoJo and how their art's androgynous quality carries over to the characters themselves. In the case of Dio, he has the most androgynous appearance of the early JoJo characters, and has been directly referred to as having a hypnotic beauty towards women and men alike. Dio's status as a vampire is no coincidence here. Vampires in fiction are very often linked to sexuality and societal taboos of the past, such as homosexuality. Because of this, it was often through vampires that homosexual relationships were able to be explored in fiction in eras when it may not have been possible to depict otherwise. Perhaps the most famous vampire story, Dracula, is itself very homoerotic if you ever read the original novel. And there is a fairly founded theory that Bram Stoker himself may have had suppressed homosexual desires that he projected onto the Dracula character, a character that he based on a real-life acquaintance. And based on the scenes Araki has referenced from Dracula, I can say with some confidence that he has read the novel before and may have picked up on some of these themes. While Dio's appearances in parts 3 and onward are the most obvious thing to bring up, I actually think there are some notable themes of sexuality with him going back to Phantom Blood. Following his initial defeat, Dio is shown to have developed a respect and admiration for Jonathan that is so extreme that it even borders on romantic. Dio says that their two fates are intertwined and that no relationship in history has existed such as theirs. He says that he believes the two of them make one, which is why he wants to claim Jonathan's body as the replacement for his own. This raises a lot of questions for Dio as a character, especially when we know he would later sire children through Jonathan's body, and that those characters are viewed as simultaneously being the sons of both Jonathan and himself. By the time of Part 3, Dio's beauty and charisma are noted by multiple characters, including men. When Avdol relays his brief meeting with Dio before the events of the story, the words he uses to describe him simply couldn't be read as any way other than sexual, with Avdol nearly becoming hypnotized by Dio's beauty. Notably, he points out that Dio possesses a dubious sensuality that one wouldn't expect from a man. Throughout Part 3, we see that Dio controls his minions through a variety of methods. Some, like Kakyoin and Polnareff, have a flesh bud that maintains mind control over them, while others are simply paid mercenaries or are controlled through fear. Some, however, are controlled through romantic devotion, such as Mariah. I think the same could be said for Undul, who has no indication of being controlled by a flesh bud and describes Dio as both strong and beautiful. And his devotion is so extreme that he is willing to commit suicide to avoid inconveniencing him. Vanilla Ice is shown to have a very similar relationship with Dio, and with him being one of Dio's most trusted followers, I wouldn't be surprised if this was romantic as well. One of the more recent developments with Dio's sexuality comes from the book Hirohiko Araki's New Manga Techniques, which elaborates on Araki's creative process behind writing villains. As part of the process for creating a character, Araki makes a character sheet that covers everything about them. The original versions of these sheets are not preserved, so he recreates some to serve as examples. On certain character sheets, we see their sex represented with a female or male symbol. For Dio's, however, he uses a male symbol with a line through it, which is often used to represent people with an androgynous gender identity. It's not 100% clear what Araki means by including the symbol, since Dio is still referred to as a man in the manga itself. What I take it to mean is that with how Dio has progressed beyond humanity as a vampire, he also exists beyond the concept of typical gender itself, enough so that Araki felt the need to differentiate him in some way. And this does fit in with how Avdol and other characters describe him. The idea of a character beyond gender is also one that Araki has repeatedly expressed interest in writing, which I'll get into later. Now, Dio is probably the most high-profile LGBT character in the series, which isn't surprising considering I just spent the last 5 minutes talking almost entirely about him. But next, I'd like to cover the other characters that we've seen sprinkled throughout the series. Our next stop here is in Part 5, which has the brief appearance of Sorbet and Gelato, two members of the assassination team that are heavily implied to be in a romantic relationship. Later on, we have the similar duo of Tiziano and Squalo, who are both shown to be extremely devoted to each other and are particularly physical together. Part 5 is also where many of Araki's most androgynous designs start to appear. Araki himself has commented on this as well by directly referring to Giorno's appearance as androgynous, which he has said is inspired by gay fashion. And this is pretty fitting since Araki actually originally intended to make Giorno a woman, but later put off that idea until Part 6. He even toyed with the idea of keeping Giorno's gender a secret throughout the story, with him being revealed as a woman at the end. With others such as Abakio and Narancho, we can see that their designs are directly based on women's fashion, with Abakio even shown wearing lipstick, as would become a common design trend for many of Araki's male characters going forward. In Araki's book, he also goes over the design of Bucciarati, saying he chose his hairstyle to give him a more feminine silhouette that exudes eroticism. Like the others, we can also see direct parallels to female fashion models. In Part 6, we saw Araki's depiction of sexuality open up even more. In its opening chapters, we have a brief appearance of a transgender man as one of Jolene's fellow prisoners, something that was omitted in the anime adaptation. Later on, we have a humorous comment from Jolene on snails being able to have sex with anything, and her saying that she's jealous of them, briefly hinting at her being bisexual herself. Perhaps the most notable topic to go over here would be the character of Anasui. There has been a long debate among JoJo fans about how Araki intended to write Anasui's gender, and I've actually had a whole video going over just this topic alone. This stems from the fact that when Anasui was first introduced, he was drawn as a woman, and switched to a man later on. There's been a lot of arguing over this, with some saying that this was due to editor interference, since if Anasui were a woman, that would lead to a lesbian relationship between them and Jolene. However, despite this being said with certainty across a lot of the community, there is actually no source at all for this claim. We also don't even know if the romantic aspect of Anasui's character was even planned at the time of his first appearance, and it may have only come about after the gender swap. Later interviews give us an idea of exactly what Araki was trying to go for here. In his panel at Luca Comics and Games 2019, Araki stated that with Anasui, he initially wanted to portray a completely androgynous character that went beyond the standard definition of gender, but that the character eventually morphed into being more masculine. It's clear that Araki has been interested in this idea for some time, and he did something very similar with the portrayal of Dio, but it seems he didn't quite commit to the idea in Part 6. In Part 7, we also have Scarlet Valentine, the first explicit lesbian character in JoJo, with much of her story based around her attraction to Lucy Steele. Finally, we have Part 9, the JoJo lands, and the main character's sibling, Dragona Joestar. Now, at our current place in the story, we don't quite know what Dragona's gender identity is. In the first chapter, we see that Jodio refers to Dragona as his brother. We also learn from his narration that Dragona loves women's fashion and receives cosmetic injections which cause a swelling in their chest. In Japanese, Dragona uses the feminine personal pronoun atashi. That isn't really as cut and dry as it sounds though, since the Japanese language doesn't really use he or she like the way we do in English. The fact is that Jodio is somewhat of an unreliable narrator and may not fully grasp Dragona's gender identity. Really, we won't know for sure unless Dragona themselves speaks about it at some point. And I do foresee that happening since hardships related to Dragona's gender expression plays a big role in their backstory, something that I feel was a very realistic inclusion from Araki. Back when this chapter released, some people were against this, but I think Araki did the right thing by injecting the harsh reality of how transgender or gender non-conforming people are treated instead of just glossing over it. JoJo has depicted societal injustices and abuse before, and I think ignoring it entirely wouldn't be a good idea. Another reading I've seen of Dragona's character from some fans suggests that the character may be making reference to the concept of Mahu, a third gender present in native Hawaiian and Tahitian cultures. Again, we don't know if that's the case for sure, but it is notable considering the part's Hawaiian setting, and it's possible Araki could have learned about it through his research. Last year, there was also a comment from Pascal Lefine, the manager for the French publication of Part 9, where he stated that Dragona is transgender. However, I would consider this sort of a tertiary source, and this person doesn't actually have any contact with Araki on an editorial level. Personally though, I do believe Dragona is transgender, and that the story will likely go in that direction. Like I said, we don't know until the character says so, but I think Dragona's action of openly presenting as female and undergoing cosmetic alterations to do so isn't something that would be done by someone who is just breaking gender norms. That's about everything there is to talk about today. I've always had a fascination with Araki's creative process, and getting to do a deep dive into this aspect of it was definitely rewarding for me. If you're interested in looking deeper into some of what I mentioned in this video, I recommend checking out the JoJo Wiki's reference gallery, which shows all of the known fashion shoot photo references for the characters. The full interview with Kaneda that I mentioned is also there if you want to read it. Finally, if there's anything interesting you think I missed, be sure to bring it up in the comments section. Araki's influences and various statements are so widespread that I'm sure there's some I didn't get to, and I'd love to hear any that you find interesting. And if I learn about enough new stuff along with whatever else comes up in the manga, I may make a follow-up to this video to go over some more. If you want to stay updated on future videos, make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell. You can also join the Hum and Beat Discord to be notified whenever I upload. Finally, I'd appreciate if you help support the channel on Patreon or by becoming a YouTube member below. All supporters get their names featured at the end of the video and can submit viewer questions. This video's question comes from Fiddlehead. They ask, what are my favorite and least favorite gradual character design changes? Well, I'm not sure I have a favorite, but I do find some of them particularly interesting. Usually I think most of them are improvements, like how if you go back in the manga, certain characters look really off before they settle into their more iconic looks. I guess the one that's the most obvious and relevant to this video would be Anasui. That one might not even qualify for the gradual change category since it's one of the most drastic shifts a character has gone through in the series. If we take into account Araki's intention of creating a character that appears genderless, I would actually consider the initial design of Anasui to be a bit of a miss, since I think it leans way too feminine for that concept. I think the one that best captures the idea is Anasui at his immediate next appearance, who seems way more like what Araki was going for before he became masculinized over time. If you want to submit questions, you can join the Patreon or YouTube membership at any tier, and leave them in the Patreon community chat or in the members-only YouTube community post. I try to answer one question per video, so feel free to leave as many as you'd like. Thank you for watching. This is the part of the video where I thank my $5 and up patrons and members. Thank you to Doorbell, Crayon, RigoVids, Zuccato, Pumpkin Doge, Marrow, Sponge Cake, Cakext, Feliciano Rabaja, Rayana Meme, Christian McDonough, Emmanuel Etienne, Pulse Dog, Zach Greenfield, FIFO, Rob Goliath, Jacob Smith, Big T, Gold, Red Hot Mayonnaise, Zenkai, Royal Slush, Keenan, Perry, Cho Henshin, Saint Bobo, Max Verstappen, John Garcia, Crankenplank, Puffin32, Fran Studios, Shin Megami Tensei Film Reviews, The Jolly Old Christian Hobbit, Griffiono, Fiddlehead, Justice, Edwarg, Joao Martins, and Danilo K.